'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Might be coming back for sure.
We know if we've got a contract, we know whether that contract's enforceable, we know the terms that are in the contract, and we know how disclaimers might or probably or may not apply depending upon the circumstances. The final thing we want to cover is what happens when you actually don't keep your side of the bargain or the other party doesn't keep their side of the bargain. Because sometimes it's not as straightforward as you might think. There are a couple of little tricks in there that I want to make sure we understand the principles behind remedies. So I think it's really interesting that we use that word in law, remedy. It's not a punishment, it's a remedy for one party not keeping their side of the bargain. And we always need to keep that in mind. Okay, let's get into remedies. So while there are a number of possible legal remedies available to the person who has been wronged or the person who hasn't had their side of the bargain delivered, traditionally the common law looked mainly at damages. Now damages is money, right? And we'll come to a bit more of that later. There are some specific remedies available for very select circumstances in equity, because remember that's a separate area of law to the third meaning of common law, different court, equity. They develop the remedies of specific performance and injunctions, which we'll come to. And in some cases, notice not in all cases, in some cases, you can terminate the contract. So let's look at these different remedies. The first thing we're going to look at is terminating the contract. So you do not have an automatic right to terminate a contract if someone hasn't held up their end of the bargain. Indeed, you might be obliged to still do what you have to do, irrespective of the breach. You can only terminate for a breach of condition. That was earlier. Okay, in this module, we looked at the difference between a condition and a warranty. So that's why it's so important to understand that difference. Because if it's a breach of condition, you can get out of the contract. If it's not a breach of condition, you can't. And by get out, I mean terminate. So you have no right to terminate for a breach of warranty. You only would have a right for damages. Remember, a condition is a term of the contract that's of fundamental importance. You wouldn't have entered the contract without that term. A warranty has lesser importance. So, yes, you can terminate the contract, but only for a breach of condition. By far the most common form of remedy available is damages. So if there's a breach of contract, a breach of collateral contract, misrepresentation, all of those courses of action that we went to when one party does do the other thing, whether it's a breach of the contract or one of those other actions that we talked about, we can get damages or money to make up for not having that obligation met. Now, be very aware of this. The objective of the court in damages is to make good the position of the party that's been injured. It's to restore the other party to the position they would have been in. It is not a penalty. Okay, so don't think when you get damages that it's like winning lotto. It isn't. Okay, you only get enough money to put you in the position that you would have been in. So imagine that you have a contract for someone to deliver fruit and vegetables. And you specify what should be in there: carrots, potatoes, and apples, right? And just say they deliver the carrots and the potatoes, but not the apples. And all up, this was, $500 worth of produce, and there was $150 of apples in there. Now, if they didn't meet that term, that they had to give you $150 worth of apples, the damages you would get would be how much it cost you to go and buy that amount of apples. Okay, so it might be slightly higher than $150 because you have to get delivery and you have to do something, but it's not going to be $500, right? It might be, $170. The courts will look at the facts, but you get the idea. It's to put you in the position you would have been in if that hadn't occurred. Now, also, what you need to be aware for the real world is that there are obligations on you as the injured party as well. For instance, the person who hasn't had the obligation met must mitigate the damages. So what does that mean? Okay, well, just let's go back to our contract here. Just say we're running a restaurant and they don't deliver the apples. And we say, well, because of that, we couldn't make apple pie. And so we lost $400 in apple pie sales. And just say we could prove that we didn't, that we missed $400 of apple pie sales because the apples weren't delivered. Now, you would think you could get $400, right? Because that's the damages that occurred because of the apples not being delivered. But the court's going to say, no. When the apples weren't delivered, you have an obligation to limit your losses. Right? And in so doing, that means you should have gone out and bought apples. And so again, your damages will be limited to 170. Now, I don't want you to learn this in detail. I'm not going to ask like a specific question about how much damages could you got. It's a very complicated area with lots of rules in it in law. But I just want you to get this idea. Damages are there to put you in the position you would have been in if the contract had been fulfilled. Even the injured party has to mitigate their losses. You have to do what you can to make that amount as small as possible. You have to do what's reasonably possible to limit those damages, okay? It's not a penalty on the other party. It's to put you in the position that you should have been in. Great. Now, I also mentioned that we have that area of law, equity, right, which came from the courts of chancery, which was separate to the common law courts originally under the third meaning of common law, which we did back in week 3. Told you it would be coming useful. Okay, so we do have some equitable remedies that are available under contract. They are specific performance and injunctions. They're not used a lot. Okay, most times we're going to use damages, but under certain circumstances, we might use specific performance. Specific performance is where you make the other party follow through in the contract. Now, often that will be because there's the subject matter of the contract is unique. It might be a block of land with a unique view. It might be a certain heirloom watch, right? You have a contract to buy your grandmother's watch and then they don't deliver. Well, damages is never going to make up for you getting your grandmother's watch, right? You can't buy another grandmother's watch. So what the courts can do in those circumstances is order the other party to go through with the contract, and that's called specific performance. Bear in mind, it is quite limited in its application. It's a complex application in an area of law, and it won't apply to things like personal services, right? So if for whatever reason you had a contract with me where I was to wash your car, the courts won't make me wash your car. Right, a personal service like that they won't make someone do, and that's tied up actually with the idea behind slavery, right? So you can't force someone to do something, etc. So the slavery principle. So but specific performance is useful when you have kind of unique subject matter in the contracts that you're dealing with. So that's making people do something. Stopping people doing something is an injunction. So sometimes the courts will stop you doing something as part of the contract, as part of the remedy to a contract. Okay, so there are 2 areas of equitable remedies that we want you to be aware of. So all up, we've got you can terminate the contract, you can get damages, which is money, you can get equitable remedy, which could be specific performance or injunction. Remember the key principles about damages. Man, I understand that's a lot of content in those 2 weeks, right? But all of it is critical to understanding how contracts are made legally. We need to have a simple, apparent contract, which requires agreement, intent, consideration. We need to ensure that that simple, apparent contract is enforceable. Particularly in this subject, we're looking at the issue of whether we got true consent. Was there duress, undue influence, unconscionable conduct? Okay. There are some other issues around capacity and legality of objects and condition lapse that are important, but probably not key to this particular subject and not the most used in business. After that, we've got to work out what's in the contract. So we've got a contract and we know that it's enforceable. We need to work out what the terms of the contract actually are. What's a condition? What's a warranty? What's a representation? Remember that Dick Bentley Productions is a key test to determine whether a representation becomes a term. And remember, we've also got the parole evidence rule and Lestrange and Graucob as key elements about written contracts that we need to know about the importance of the written terms and what that has to do with what's in the contract and what isn't. Once we've got those terms worked out, then we also need to think about disclaimers if they're part of a contract and how they are read narrowly, and the three elements that we looked at in terms of disclaimers: incorporated into the contract, read narrowly, and that they can't be misrepresented. Finally, what happens if you breach a term of the contract, or you're the injured party and the other party breaches a term of the contract, don't fulfill their obligations? We can terminate the contract if it's a breach of condition, but not a breach of warranty. We can get damages, but remember we need to mitigate them, and it's only to put us in the position we would have been in. And we have the equitable remedies of specific performance and injunctions in unusual circumstances. There we have it, contract. A whole lot of stuff, but very important to business.